All right, are we? All right, and I think we're live. Okay, great. So my name is Justin Mullis. I am a writer and researcher currently working on, on my PhD at Bowling Green State in Ohio. I'm a regular guest reviewer on the podcast The Film Find, where I handle their kaiju movie reviews, and I also wrote a chapter for the book Giant Creatures in Our World, which is a collection of essays dealing with kaiju. And I've also written chapters for John LeMay's books Kong Unmade and Jaws Unmade, if you're familiar with those. That's just a small fraction of my work. If you want to know more about me after this presentation, you can check out my Academia.edu page. So the presentation that you're here for is titled Western Monsters, Japan Style, the Vampire, Frankenstein, and Werewolf Films of Toho Studios. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with Toho. However, when you hear that name, probably the first movie monsters you think about are not going to be Frankenstein's monster, vampires, or werewolves. However, between 1965 and 1974, Toho did produce 6 films featuring those iconic movie monsters. These films were Frankenstein Conquers the World, War of the Gargantuas, Horror of the Wolf, and the notorious Bloodthirsty Trilogy. And I'm going to be covering a lot of material in this presentation. So I'm going to ask people to possibly hold any questions till the end, and then if time permits, I'll try to answer some of them. All right, so what I'm going to do here today is that I'm going to take a look at these films and ask how these movies took these iconic Western monsters and transformed them for a Japanese audience. And my inspiration for this approach was the work of American anthropologist Laura Bohaman. And so Bohaman, from 1949 to 1953, she lived with the Tiv people in central Nigeria. And she wrote a really famous essay about them in 1966 called Shakespeare in the Bush. And in this essay, Bohaman talks about how while she was living with the Tiv, they were a storytelling culture, as pretty much all cultures are. But so she needed to share a story from her own culture with them. And so what the story she tried to share was Hamlet by Shakespeare. And as she found out, the Tiv had a really hard time understanding this story because it was full of all kinds of very specific cultural references that they just didn't understand. And I'll give you one example that's very germane to what we're talking about here today, and that's ghosts. So if you know anything about Hamlet, you know that the story starts when the ghost of Hamlet's father appears before him and tells him that he was murdered by Hamlet's uncle, right, his father's brother. Well, the Tiv, they didn't know what a ghost was. That was a concept that just did not exist in their culture. And so the only way Bohaman could make the story intelligible to them was by substituting the ghost for a witch, which was a character that they did have in their culture, in their folklore. So a few years ago, I was actually teaching this essay to some undergraduates, and I decided to give them another example, which was Akira Kurosawa's 1957 film Throne of Blood, which was produced by Toho. And if you've seen this movie, you might know it's an adaptation of another Shakespeare play, namely Macbeth. Um, and if you know the story of Macbeth, you know that the drama in that one starts off when Macbeth gets a prophecy from 3 witches. But Kurosawa changed things up because why? Witches don't exist in Japanese folklore, not like they do in Western folklore anyway. And so he swapped out the witches for yokai, which are the monsters from Japanese folklore. Um, and so, in this same vein, I wanted to look at how Toho adapted and changed the familiar figures of Frankenstein's monster, werewolves, and vampires for a Japanese audience. And real quick, something kind of a trigger warning, just because I am talking about horror movies. And so these are films that involve blood, nudity, violence, including sexual violence. And I'm not planning to show anything graphic or talk about anything in any lurid detail. But if you do decide to go off and watch these movies, just know they're not family-friendly films necessarily like the Godzilla movies are. All right. So first up on the docket is Toho's Frankenstein movies. And these are the movies that I'm imagining that probably everyone watching this panel has seen or has stood the best chance of seeing. First of all, they're the only films that actually qualify as kaiju movies because they're giant monsters. Um, but the other thing is that they were also both dubbed into English. They were shown in U.S. theaters back in the day. They were broadcast a lot on television back in the late 80s, early 90s. That's how I first saw them. And they've also both been put out on DVD. Now, there's a lot of misinformation out there about why Toho made these movies, but here's what we actually know. So in 1964, Hollywood TV and movie mogul Henry G. Saperstein, who was part of a company called United Productions of America, or UPA, he entered into a joint agreement with Tomoyuki Tanaka of Toho, and they struck a deal to make 3 science fiction pictures, all of which would be directed by Ishiro Honda, with special effects by Eiji Tsuburaya and music by Akira Ifukube. 2 of these movies were Toho's Frankenstein movies, and one of them was Invasion of Astro Monster, aka Godzilla vs. Monster Zero. So the idea for UPA and Toho's first collaboration to be a Frankenstein movie seems to have come from the American side, appropriately enough. It came from UPA because story and synopsis for Frankenstein Conquers the World is credited to Saperstein's associate Ruben Berkovich and writer Jerry Soule, who would go on to work on series like Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, and Star Trek. However, if Berkovich and Soule ever actually produced any kind of story treatment or script for Frankenstein Conquers the World, we don't know about it. It hasn't survived. Rather, the earliest script that we actually have is from July of 1964, and it was written by Toho veteran Takashi Kimura, who's probably best known at this point in his career, was best known for writing the scripts for Rodan, the H-Man, the Human Vapor, Matango. And the thing you might notice about all of those movies is that, first of all, with the exception of Rodan, none of them are kaiju movies. They all involve smaller monsters. And secondly, all of them, and I would include Rodan here, are among Honda's darkest films. So, in other words, it makes sense that Kimura would be the guy that would be assigned the job of writing a Frankenstein movie. But why did UPA feel that a Frankenstein movie was the right choice for their first collaboration with Toho, and why did Toho agree to this? Well, one answer can be found in Susan Tyler Hitchcock's book, Frankenstein, A Cultural History. Hitchcock writes that from the late 1950s on through the 1960s and into the early 70s, movie studios from around the world started churning out dozens of cheap Frankenstein thrillers aimed squarely at adolescent baby boomers who were looking for cheap entertainment as a pretext to, go into the drive-in and make an out. And filmmakers in both Hollywood and abroad knew that horror movies were popular with teens, they were cheap to make, and they were even cheaper if the monster on your marquee was one that existed in the public domain, which the Frankenstein monster more or less did. And in fact, I actually did some research here, and I looked at movies made between 1964 and 1974, so a 10-year period, so the exact period when Toho's 2 Frankenstein movies came out. And during that one decade, there were 17 Frankenstein movies made and released there were 17 movies made, with at least one released every year, with the sole exception of 1968, which is kind of funny because 1968 was the Frankenstein monster's 150th birthday. So I guess everybody just forgot to celebrate it. Anyway, these factors go a long way in explaining why UPA and Toho seized upon Frankenstein's monster as an ideal creature for their first joint venture. They knew it was a recognizable name. They knew it would make money at the box office, whether in the US or Japan or anywhere else. But, so the question we're here to talk about, how exactly did Toho change the Frankenstein monster for the Japanese audience? And the answer is, at least with Frankenstein Conquers the World, very little. I mean, he's still recognizable as the Frankenstein monster. He's bigger, but, Frankenstein's monster is already kind of big. So, there isn't that much of a difference. Now, Frankenstein Conquers the World was an international success, and so UPA and Toho rushed a sequel into production. And that film was War of the Gargantuas, or as it's known in Japan, Frankenstein's monster Sandra versus Gyra. And it was once again written by Takashi Kimura. Only this time, Kimura doesn't appear to have had any input from UPA. And this led to a film that's about as far away from a conventional Frankenstein movie as you can get. Um, Now, why is this? Well, according to researchers Steve Reifel and Ed Godwicheski, they say that Komura actually based his script for War of the Gargantuas on an ancient Japanese myth, which is called Umihiko and Yamahiko, or the Sea Boy and the Mountain Boy. And this is a myth that's found in the Kojiki, or Record of Ancient Matters, from 712 CE. It's the oldest written text in Japan's history that we still have copies of. Um, and the story of Umihiko and Yamahiko is basically your kind of classic Cain and Abel style tale of sibling rivalry. Umihiko is a fisherman. He lives by the sea. His younger brother, Yamahiko, is a hunter. He lives in the mountains. One day they decide, just to see what it's like to walk a mile in the other's shoes, that, they're going to switch jobs. And it turns out they're not very good at each other's jobs, but Yamahiko is especially bad at fishing, and he actually loses his brother Umihiko's favorite fishing hook. And so Umihiko gets really mad about this, and he orders his brother to go down to the bottom of the ocean and find it. And so Yamahiko agrees. He dives down to the bottom of the ocean, and when he's down there, he actually meets the god of the sea, and he makes really good friends with him, and he ends up marrying his daughter. And then when he decides he wants to go back and live on the surface like he used to, the god of the sea gives him a pair of magic jewels that allow him to control the tide. So, Yamahiko with his new wife, they go back, they start a village together. It's really prosperous. Umihiko still hates his brother, and so when he sees how prosperous his villages, he gets really jealous, and he attacks his brother. But his brother has these magic jewels that allow him to control the tide. And so he actually makes the tide come in, and he almost drowns his brother until his brother eventually stops attacking him and begs for forgiveness. Now, it's pretty clear that Komura only used the broadest strokes of this myth when writing his script for War of the Gargantuas, but nevertheless, a lot of the key elements are still there. You've got two feuding brothers, one that represents sea, one that represents land, with the brother that represents the sea as the aggressor, and the brother that represents the land as the non-belligerent. And, this is an interesting example because we see here how a Japanese myth was used to reinterpret a classic Western movie monster. And in this case, it was reinterpreted so much, it's hardly even recognizable anymore. All right. So next up is Horror of the Wolf. And this is Toho's one and only werewolf movie. And unlike the other films I'm going to be discussing, this is the one that I'm sure few, if any, American kaiju fans are likely to have seen. So Toho came out with this movie in 1973. It was directed by Masashi Matsumoto, who would later go on to direct the really influential 1982 cyberpunk anime film Technopolis 21C. This movie had a team of 4 writers, but the one that I think is the most interesting and the one that everybody here would probably care about is one of the co-writers was Jun Fukuda, who's best known as the director of movies like Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, Son of Godzilla, Godzilla vs. Megalon, Gigan, Mechagodzilla, right? So he was one of the writers on this. The score for it was done by Riichiro Manabe, who did the music for Godzilla vs. Hedorah and Godzilla vs. Megalon. He also actually did the music for the vampire films we're going to be talking about, the Bloodthirsty Trilogy. And in that same vein, Teruyushi Nakano, right? I think everybody should know who he is. He worked on all of the Godzilla movies I just mentioned, but he did the special effects for both Horror of the Wolf and Bloodthirsty Trilogy. Now, despite the considerable talent behind this film, it has never been shown outside Japan. It was never shown in US theaters or on television. There's no US home video release. It is on DVD in Japan, though, but there's no English dub for it, and there are no subtitles in existence. Naturally, all of that made it a little bit hard to research, but some of that difficulty was mitigated due to the fact that Horror of the Wolf is based on a 1971 novel, Okami no Mansho, by Kazumasa Hirai. And that novel is available in English, actually. It was originally translated in 1985 by Edward Lipset, and the original physical publication of it is out of print, but I did some digging a couple years ago and I found out that it had been turned into an ebook on Amazon under a different title, Wolf Guy. Okami no Mansho translates actually as Wolf Crest, but they went with Wolf Guy for the ebook edition. So anyway, I read this novel and I've watched the Toho movie in Japanese, and really the two line up pretty much exactly the same. It's a pretty faithful adaptation. The exception is the ending, which isn't actually different. They just left out some details that are in the novel. So because this is one that I don't think a lot of people have seen, I'm going to do a little bit of a synopsis here. So Horror of the Wolf opens in the snowy wilderness of Alaska. We are introduced to a young Japanese-American boy who's our protagonist, Akira Inugame. We see him playing with a pack of wolves while his mother looks on. Suddenly, a plane arrives and a group of men with guns get out of it. We don't know who these men are. It's never explained in the novel, and I presume it's not explained in the movie either. But they kill Akira's parents. They miss the child, though, and so he's left to be raised by wolves. The film jumps ahead quite a bit, and we now find a teenage Akira living in Tokyo and attending a really prestigious private school. However, this school has recently been overrun by a violent gang of juvenile delinquents led by a guy named Do Haguro, who's the son of a powerful Yakuza don. As soon as Akira arrives, Haguro's gang targets him for some bullying and torment, but they have a hard time about it because Akira is nearly invulnerable, at least to, punches and kicks and that kind of stuff. And Akira's willingness to stand up to Haguro's gang wins him the unwanted admiration of his classmates and also the not entirely unwanted affection of his homeroom teacher, Kiko Komura. And I should probably point out that Kiko is supposed to be in her early 20s. So while the subject of her affections is still one of her teenage students, there isn't really a huge age gap between them. So it's weird, but maybe not that weird, just whatever that's worth. All right. Anyway, so Akira... the students of the school, inspired by Akira's willingness to stand up to Haguro's gang, decide to throw a rally where they are demanding for the gang to be removed from campus. Haguro's gang doesn't take well to this. They attack the rally and they try to kill the female student body president. But Akira shows up, he intervenes, he saves the student body president's life, and actually kills the gang's second in command in the process. This obviously makes Haguro really angry, and so in retaliation, he kidnaps Kiko, rapes her, and then holds her prisoner in his father's heavily guarded home. Akira rushes off to save Kiko, and after he gets inside the compound, he fights Haguro, who is armed with a katana. He actually gets pretty messed up here in this fight, but ultimately he manages to kill Haguro. Now, when him and Kiko try to leave, they find themselves surrounded by Yakuza, including Haguro's father, who isn't about to let them walk out of here alive, right? They just murdered his son. But fortunately, fire gets started on the compound, and that provides a distraction. It's not as deus ex machina as I'm making it sound. There's a good reason for the fire, but I can't go into that right now. But anyway, there's a fire, and this is enough of a distraction that Akira can transform again into a wolf, and he kills all of these Yakuza, and him and Kiko manage to escape. Now, in a lot of ways, I think that Horror of the Wolf feels really ahead of its time. The idea of kind of mixing like teenagers and supernatural monsters is something that might seem like a cliche to a lot of people because, we've had stuff like Buffy and Twilight and Teen Wolf. But I think at the time, when this novel came out and then this movie, this must have seemed really cutting edge, right? A really new idea. And apparently, part of the reason why Harai decided to make the protagonist of his werewolf novel a teenager and set the action in a school is because at the same time he was writing this novel, he was also writing a Spider-Man manga. And so that was the influence there. He saw Spider-Man. But of course, the most interesting aspect of Horror of the Wolf for me is the depiction of the werewolf, because in Western culture, we tend to portray werewolves one of two ways. They are either, horrible, inhuman monsters or they are tragic victims of a curse that they can't control. But Akira is really neither of those things. He's actually a very stoic hero, and his lycanthropy isn't so much a curse as it is a superpower. Now, Japanese film journalist Jasper Sharp tries to account for some of this discrepancy by arguing that, Horror the Wolf is not like a Western werewolf movie because, you know, Japanese filmmakers or writers wouldn't have had any exposure to what Western werewolf movies were like. And his evidence for this is that he points out that the 1941 movie The Wolfman, made by Universal Studios with Lon Chaney Jr., that movie was never released in Japan because it came out on December 12th, 1941, which was 5 days after Pearl Harbor. And, that kind of ruined the Japan-America relations for a little while and stopped the exchange of films. But the problem with Sharp's argument there is that it's not the whole story. Universal had made a werewolf movie before The Wolfman called The Werewolf of London. That came out in 1935, and that was shown in Japan. And then after World War II, you had Hammer's The Curse of the Werewolf, directed by Terence Fisher. And that also came out in Japanese theaters in 1961, and then really quickly made its way to television. And then you don't even need Western werewolf movies because you can go all the way back to 1931, right before any of these movies, and you have a very famous Japanese horror novelist, Kido Okamoto. He publishes a short story called Jinro, which literally means werewolf, which was actually a rewrite of British writer Frederick Marryat's 1839 short story, The White Wolf of Hart's Mountains. So, Horai had werewolf media in Japan, both domestic and foreign, that he could have drawn on. But the other thing here is that I kind of think that this whole discussion about what werewolf media was and wasn't available, right, and from where, kind of misses the point, because the question we should be asking is, does Japan have any kind of indigenous werewolf tradition? And the answer to that is, well, it's kind of complicated. So wolves today in Japan are extinct, right? They were wiped out during the Meiji Restoration. But even before that, wolves were not a particularly widespread species in Japan. They were largely limited to the southern and the northern ends of the country. Now, one of the most in-depth explorations of animal folklore in Japan is this book-length essay. It's almost 100 pages, called "The Goblin, Fox, and Badger and Other Witch Animals of Japan" from 1959 by the scholar U.A. Kazel. And Kazel writes that on the subject of wolves, they play little to no role in Japanese mythology, folklore, or art. They do show up in Japanese religion. The Japanese word for wolf is okame, which literally means great god, and wolves were sometimes regarded as messengers of the gods. And you can see this, for example, in the Studio Ghibli film Princess Mononoke, for example. But that's still a relatively minor role, especially when you compare wolves with other animals like foxes, tanuki, snakes, cats, right? All of whom play really prominent roles in Japanese culture. And what folklore there is about wolves in Japan tends to portray them as pretty benign animals. In other words, almost the complete opposite of how they're portrayed in European culture. And Kazel's work here has been backed up by more recent scholarship by folklorist John Knight and also professor of environmental history Brett L. Walker. Now, Kazel does note that, I'm going to read this quote from him. He says, quote, "There may also have been a more general belief of old that, like the goblin cat, the wolf could take the shape of a person that he had previously devoured and live in the family for some nefarious purpose in his or her shape," end quote. And what Kazel's talking about here is the term that he's translating as goblin cat is kaibo, which is a kind of yokai. And the kaibo, they're cats that if they drink a dead human's blood, they can take the form of that person. They can then shapeshift into that person. And Kazel thought that there might have been a similar tradition in Japan about wolves. And this was based on his own research in the country into their folklore. And he pointed to this one folktale in particular called A Thousand Wolves. That he actually found in the regions of Shikoku, and he reprints it in this essay. And so to summarize it, basically in the story A Thousand Wolves, you have a samurai who's walking alone one night in the mountains when he's attacked by a pack of wolves. And he manages to drive the pack off without having to unsheath his sword, right? But then he just kind of, bumps them on the head with the blunt end of it, right? But then later that night, as he's continuing his journey, this pack comes back. And now they're all wearing iron pots on their heads like helmets, and they attack him again. And so the samurai is forced to unsheath his sword. He cuts the pots in half, and manages to drive the wolves away once more. But he thinks this is a little weird, right? Wolves wearing pots as helmets, that's not normal. And so as day is breaking, he comes across a blacksmith's shop, and he goes inside and he asks the blacksmith, do you make and sell pots? And the blacksmith is like, yeah, I make and sell pots. And he says, did anything weird happen in any of your pots recently? And he's like, since you should mention it, I found a bunch of them cut in half this morning. And the samurai's like, okay. And by any chance, was anybody that lives in your house hurt last night? And he's like, since you mention it, my mom went out to use the bathroom last night, and when she came back, she had this big gash on her head. And, now she's lying in bed not feeling very well. And the samurai's like, oh yeah, that's too bad. Can I go see your mother? And the blacksmith's like, sure. And he takes him back to his mother's bedroom. And as soon as the samurai sees the old mother, he pulls out his sword and cuts her head off. And of course the son is kind of upset about this, but the samurai explains why he did it. And sure enough, the mother's body turns into that of a large wolf. And then they start tearing up the floorboards, and they find the actual bones of the mother buried under the floor. So the wolf had eaten her and assumed her shape. And so based on this story, Castle comes to the conclusion that there must have existed a werewolf tradition in Japan at one point. But he then speculates that the reason why you don't find more legends like this in Japan is because the Japanese just didn't have a lot of contact with wolves. And so as the story spread outside of Shikoku and the regions where wolves lived, the wolf was swapped out with an animal that people were more familiar with. So exactly what we're talking about here, right? Adapting monsters. And Castle says, one of the monsters that was probably the best candidate was the dog. And he, as an example of this, he points to a story that's in the Nihongi, which is another ancient collection of Japanese myths. It's actually the second oldest, right, after the Kojiki. And he just points out that in the Nihongi, there's a story about a guy named Ayashi no Wamaro, who was supposed to be this famous robber. He caused a lot of trouble. So eventually the emperor sent a dude, Ohoki no Ome, after him to kind of, basically stop him from, robbing people. And so what Ohoki no Omi does is he finds where Ayashi sleeps at night. He sets fire to his house, and then it is surprised when out of the flames a dog the size of a horse and solid white jumps out and attacks him. And he manages to kill it, cutting its head off, at which point it turns back into this dude, Ayashi. So, that also sounds a lot like a European werewolf story. And it's worth pointing out that, in fact, one of the names for wolves in some regions of Japan is Yama Inu, which means mountain dog. And also that in our story, Horror the Wolf, our hero's last name is Inugame, which literally means dog god. And it's also the name of a particular kind of yokai. I don't really have time to get into that. But Inugami are really fascinating. I've been doing a lot of research on them, but they're just sort of tangentially related to this. But, ultimately, we need to keep in mind that we're still talking about what is a minority tradition in Japan. So and that by and large wolves are portrayed as being benevolent. And in fact, there's a Japanese folklorist, Tanigawa Kenichi, who has argued that this story, the first one, A Thousand Wolves, is itself based on a kind of benevolent tradition, because he points out that blacksmiths' mothers, for some reason in ancient Japan, were believed to be really good midwives. They were good at delivering babies. And he also points out that wolves were thought to be good midwives. They were good at delivering babies. And so Kenichi's argument is that at some point these traditions were conflated so that you would end up with a wolf in the shape of a blacksmith's mother. And I really think that it is the combination of these two ideas, right? The wolf as shapeshifter and the wolf as, benevolent protector, that explains how you end up with the heroic werewolf that you do in Harai's fiction and Toho's only werewolf movie. All right, so next up we have the Bloodthirsty Trilogy, and we just got done discussing, whether or not there are werewolves in Japan. And as we saw, the answer is somewhat unclear. It's a lot of conjecture, a lot of speculation. However, I can say with certainty that no such ambiguity exists with regards to the question of vampires. Vampires, all scholars on both sides of the Pacific agree, are not indigenous to Japan. They're a foreign import. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't creatures in Japanese folklore that you could describe as being like vampires. One example is the kappa, which is another kind of yokai. It looks like a sort of turtle duck, and it lives in rivers and ponds, and it sometimes sucks the blood out of the anus of livestock. And I imagine most kaiju fans are probably familiar with the kappa from the really strange 2010 movie Death Kappa by Tomo Haraguchi. And I'll just throw out there also real quick that Haraguchi also directed a really great Japanese werewolf movie that came out back in 2004 called Kibakichi. So if you haven't seen that, I'd look it up. Aside from the kappa, you have the Yuki Onna, or Snow Woman, which British horror author and film critic Kim Newman has described as the closest you'll get to a Japanese vampire. The Yuki Onna has shown up in a couple of notable places in cinema. You've got Toho's Academy Award-winning 1965 film Kwaidan, directed by Masakai Kobayashi. You've also got Akira Kurosawa's 1990 anthology film Dreams, for which Ishiro Honda served as a consultant. And the Yuki Onna did get a full feature film to herself in 1968 from Daiei. It was directed by this guy Tokuzo Tanaka, who did a lot of really great movies for Daiei based on Japanese folklore. And Yuki Onna, also, the score was done by Akira Ifukube. But perhaps the most obvious candidate for a creature in Japanese folklore, like a vampire, are those aforementioned kaibo, right? Those goblin cats. And in particular, there's one famous folktale called The Vampire Cat of Nabeshima, which was popularized in the West by writer A.B. Mitford. And that folktale was turned into a film, again at Daiei, again by Tokuzo Tanaka, called The Haunted Castle. And it came out in 1969. But, as researcher Matthew Bresford notes in his 2008 book, From Demons to Dracula, we need to make a distinction between creatures that are like vampires or vampiric and proper vampires. And what do we mean by proper vampires? Well, we mean a human corpse that rises from the grave to drain the blood of the living. And this is because, as scholars like G. David Keyworth and others have shown, vampires, when defined this way, are a unique and fairly recent development in folklore. They really only come about in the very late 1600s and early 1700s in the Slavic regions of Central Europe. So that's one reason why you wouldn't necessarily find them in Japan. But the other reason is because also when you define vampires this way, you realize that in order to get vampires, you need corpses. And Japan's long history of cremating their dead, makes that a little difficult. So if you were going to get vampires in Japan, right, if they were going to find a home in the land of the rising sun, which frankly doesn't sound all that pleasant for them, but if you were going to, they're going to have to come from outside of the country. And that's exactly what you find in the Bloodthirsty Trilogy. So The Bloodthirsty Trilogy naturally consists of 3 films. The Vampire Doll, 1970, Bloodthirsty Eyes, 1971, and Bloodthirsty Rose, 1974. Now, I should go ahead and point out that these films are a thematic rather than narrative trilogy. They're all self-contained individual stories. They don't connect to each other. You can watch them in whatever order or watch them by themselves. It doesn't matter. However, they did all have the same staff working on them. So they were all conceived by Toho Studios producer and horror novelist Fumio Tanaka. And his Godzilla connection is that he wrote the novelization for 1991's Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. They were also all written, these films, by E. Ogawa, who also wrote the screenplay for Ishiro Honda's 1970 kaiju film Space Amoeba, aka Yog Monster from Space. And lastly, they were all directed by Michio Yamamoto. There's kind of a funny story here, which is that Yamamoto says that the reason why he got the job directing these films is because he was at a party with Fumio Tanaka, and Tanaka overheard him saying how he, quote, wanted to make a movie that would really make audiences scream, end quote. And so based on this, Tanaka thought that he'd be a good guy to direct a horror movie, or 3. And but the thing was that this was not what Yamamoto actually wanted. He didn't want to do movies about vampires. He wanted to do like Hitchcockian thrillers. And I guess him and Fumio Tanaka must have struck some kind of deal, because Yamamoto did get to do a Hitchcockian thriller. It's called Terror in the Streets. It was just recently subtitled, and you can it was released actually as a double feature with the first of the Bloodthirsty trilogy, Vampire Doll. So but yeah, so then to get into the films now, I should probably talk about all 3 films in the Bloodthirsty trilogy. I don't really have time to do that. And also, I kind of just want to talk about my favorite, which is the Bloodthirsty Rose, the last one, because that's the one that has the most interesting kind of like lore and history that it's playing around with. So the Bloodthirsty Rose, which was released in the U.S. under the title Evil of Dracula in 1994 on VHS by Paramount. The hero of this movie is a psychology professor named Shiraki, who has just got a new job at a all-girls school that's located in the countryside city of Nagano, real Japanese city. And so Shirake, once he starts at the school, he really quickly meets these 3 students, Kumi, Yukiko, and Kyoko, who are all roommates. And they tell him that a 4th friend of theirs, who was also their roommate, just recently went missing, and they don't know what happened to her. And then furthermore, shortly after that, Kyoko goes missing, but she turns back up, only she has these weird, bite marks on her breasts. And so Shirake talks to the school doctor, Shimomura, about this. And Shimomura, it turns out, is also an expert on local folklore. And he tells Shirake this local legend about a Christian missionary who 200 years ago showed up in Japan. Now, at this time, Christianity was illegal in the country. So once he was found by the authorities, he was tortured until he renounced his faith. Afterwards, he was set free, and he wandered across the country until he eventually winds up in Nagano, at which point he's half crazy and dying of thirst, and so he kills a 15-year-old girl and drinks her blood, turning both of them into vampires. So, once Shimomura and Shirake decide that, they're obviously dealing with vampires here, they decide that, they're going to try and protect these 3 schoolgirls who are being targeted. And it ultimately turns out that the vampire, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but the vampire turns out to be the school principal, who is played by actor Shin Kishida. And if you're a Godzilla fan, you'll know Shin Kishida as Interpol agent Nambara from 1974's Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. But if you're an Ultraman fan, you'll know him from the series Return of Ultraman, where he played Ken Sakata. And if you're a Super Sentai fan, you might know him as playing Commander Daizaburo from Taiyo Sentai Sun Vulcan. Shin Kishida. He got around. He was in all the big tokusatsu franchises. But he was also known for playing a vampire, because he was not only the vampire in Bloodthirsty Rose, but also the film before it, Bloodthirsty Eyes. And he was famous enough in this role that as late as 1979, Kishida makes a cameo as his vampire character in the Toho film The Adventures of Kosuke Kindaichi, which is directed by Nobuhiko Obayashi, who's best known for the movie House. But what's also interesting here is that that movie, The Adventures of Kosuke Kindaichi, is based on a novel by writer Seishei Yokomizu. And I'm going to ask you to remember that name because he's going to come back up here in a minute. Anyway, so, ultimately, it's a horror movie, so Shirake doesn't, save everybody in the end. He tries to, but he ultimately just ends up saving one of the girls, Kume, and, he kills Shin Kishida by driving a hot fireplace poker through his chest, which is pretty cool. So as far as vampire kills go. Now, the Bloodthirsty Trilogy has often been kind of, derided as just sort of this pastiche of the Hammer movies, which is somewhat true. I mean, they made these movies because the Hammer Dracula movies were super popular in Japan at the time. But I think that if you only look at the Bloodthirsty Trilogy on that level as Hammer knockoffs, you're missing a lot. And in particular, you're missing one of the things that makes the Bloodthirsty Rose so unique, which is that the vampires in this movie are Christians. And that's weird, right? Because, if you know anything about vampires, you know that they have what can only be described as an antagonistic relationship with Christianity, right? They're warded off by crosses. They're burned by holy water. And if you want to understand why the vampire in Bloodthirsty Rose is a Christian, you need to know a little something about the history of Christianity in Japan. And so I'll go ahead and mention here that two books that were really big helps for me in doing this research was Rebecca Sutter's book, Holy Ghosts from 2015, and also Jonathan Clement's book, Christ's Samurai from 2016. So real quick, some history. So Christianity arrives in Japan in 1549 via Catholic missionaries from Portugal. They are actually really successful, and so in 30 years they have 150,000 Christian converts. However, we should keep in mind that this is still a small percentage of the Japanese population, and that all of these converts are pretty much confined to the prefecture of Nagasaki. So in 1600, the Tokugawa shogunate comes into power, and they ban foreigners from entering Japan, and they outlaw foreign religions, including Christianity. But that doesn't mean that all of these people who have converted to Christianity suddenly just decide to give up their faith. And one place where Christianity remains really fervent is in the city of Shimbara, which is located along the coast of Nagasaki. Now, to understand this next part of the story, you need to know that in the early 1600s, Shimbara is controlled by these people, the Matsukura family. And the Matsukura family were not good people. They were basically taxing their citizens, their subjects, to death. And I'm not saying that to be hyperbolic. I mean literally, because taxes back then were paid in rice. And so if you took all the rice that a family harvested in a given season as taxes, you weren't leaving them any food. And furthermore, if you couldn't pay all of your taxes in rice, then the Matsukuras would have you imprisoned and or executed, which is also something that they did. So like I said, not good people. And so it's also not surprising that because of this persecution, it ultimately results in what's known as the Shimabara Rebellion, which happens on December 17th, 1637. You have 37,000 Christians rise up in open revolt against the Japanese government in Shimabara, and they're led by this 17-year-old kid named Amakusa Shiro. And historians don't know a lot about Amakusa, but there are a lot of legends about him, and it seems to suggest that the people in Shimabara considered him to be a kind of messiah, right? They tell stories about him performing miracles. They tell stories about prophecies being associated with him, right? But ultimately their rebellion is not successful. It goes on for about 5 months, and then the shogun gets tired of it, and he sends in a bunch of troops, and he has them all killed, and Amakusa Shiro is beheaded. And because this rebellion is so closely associated with Christianity, it just causes the shogunate to double down on their anti-Christian policies. And Amakusa Shiro kind of goes down into Japanese history in a similar way that like Benedict Arnold is thought about in American history, right? He's like the ultimate traitor, the ultimate bad guy. Now, you might wonder what all of this has to do with Toho's vampire movies from the 70s. Well, in October of 1931, Universal's film version of Dracula, the one with Bela Lugosi, comes out in Japan, and it's a big hit. But Stoker's novel that movie is based on was not available in Japan at that time. In fact, it wouldn't become available until 1956. So what happens? Well, in 1939, Seishei Yokomizo, that same author I mentioned before, right, and told you to remember, Yokomizo decides that he can cash in on the popularity of Dracula by publishing a novel called Dokuro Kengyo, or Skull Abbot. And what this novel is it's kind of a bootlegged version of Dracula, right? He takes Stoker's novel and sets it in Tokugawa era Japan, and he makes the Dracula character Amakusa Shiro. And this book becomes Japan's first vampire novel. And it has a huge impact, right? So much so that, jump ahead to 1959, you have Nobu Nakagawa, Japan's first kind of celebrity horror director. He makes this movie Onna Kiyu Ketsuke, right? The Lady Vampire. It's Japan's first real vampire movie. Guess what? The vampire in the movie is revealed to be Amakusa Shiro. Shortly after that, in 1967, you have really famous Japanese author Futaro Yamada. He publishes this big fantasy epic, Makai Tensho, literally demon resurrection. Who's the villain? Amakusa Shiro. Is he a vampire? Not exactly. He's kind of more of a lich. He's an undead sorcerer, but close enough. And Makai Tensho is super successful. It gets turned into manga, anime, video games. There are 2 movies, including one directed by Kinji Fukusatsu, that ends up being nominated for 3 Japanese Academy Awards and winning 2. And so, I'm almost out of time here. I could keep talking about this stuff all day, but the point is that, once you have this kind of context, you begin to understand why the vampire in Toho's The Bloodthirsty Rose is a Christian missionary. Because really, there's just this history here where, Christianity is seen as this weird foreign religion in Japan, and, they are associated with vampires because of Seishei Yokomizo's novel. In conclusion, I just want to, thank everyone who tuned in. I hope that if you haven't seen these films, you'll go out and watch them now. If you have seen them, I hope when you rewatch them, maybe you'll get something a little bit different out of them because of the cultural context. I want to thank Kyle Yount for inviting me to be part of this event. It's been a great weekend. And again, if you want to see more of my research, you can check out my Academia.edu page. There's the address right down there at the bottom of the screen, or just Google, Justin Mullis, Academia.edu. Thank you.